conditions faced by humanitarian workers. The Secretary-General has been following closely the polio immunization campaign currently underway in Gaza. The images of young children receiving their vaccinations are both moving and distressing. The polio pauses are a rare hope and humanity amid the horror in Gaza. I note that the arrangements established between the UN agencies and the IDF to pause military activity in the designated vaccination areas have been respected. Like the Secretary-General, I commend all those involved in this undertaking, especially our extraordinary humanitarian colleagues leading the campaign. Continue to focus on ending the killing and destruction in Gaza. We cannot lose sight of the alarming situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. It's Israeli military operations, settler attacks, and violence against Israelis. Most recently, Israel launched on 28 August scale military operations against alleged terrorist cells in Jenin, Tulkarm, and Tubas governorates. The operations also involved the use of airstrikes, and week-long operations resulted in clashes with armed Palestinians, civilian casualties, and damage to civilian infrastructure. The operations were launched amid attacks and clashes throughout the occupied West Bank, including in the Hebron area, with 2 car bombs near Israeli settlements the night of 30 August, the killing of 3 Israelis in their car the following day, and a subsequent Israeli military operation in the area. Overall, since 7 October, some 6 and 15 Israelis have been killed in the occupied West Bank, Jerusalem. All perpetrators of violence, Israeli or Palestinian, must be accountable. Recent dangerous and provocative acts are further inflaming the situation. Statements by Palestinian armed groups calling for further violence and attacks are unacceptable and must cease. The recent inflammatory acts and statements by an Israeli minister at the holy sites in Jerusalem add to an already explosive situation. And the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem must be respected and upheld, recognizing the special and historic role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy sites in Jerusalem. President, with every passing day, we get further away from the objective of ending the occupation and achieving a viable two-state. We remain convinced that durable peace will only be achieved when Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state reside in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. It is our responsibility to do all we can to support the parties in reaching that objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. De Carlo for her briefing. I'll give the floor to Ms. Eden Bosorno.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to update the Council alongside Under Secretary-General De Carlo following our briefing last week. Members of the Council, the latest developments in Gaza and the West Bank compel us to reaffirm yet again the equal value of human life. The aim of international humanitarian law is to limit the consequences of war by setting minimum standards of conduct to meet the needs of those who are not fighting the basic requirements of humanity. Yet, suffering and devastation show there has been almost no limit to the inhumanity unfolding before our eyes. There are no winners in this war. Instead, it is marked by loss and agony, and bearing the heaviest burden. As USG DiCarlo has just noted, we see this in the Hamas attacks on October 7, when more than 1,000 people, scores of children included. We see this in the recent killings of 6 hostages. Again, as USG DiCarlo has said, an estimated 101 foreign nationals remain hostage in Gaza, including the remains of those declared dead. We are alarmed by the treatment and conditions of the remaining hostages and the without visits or assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, we also have grave concerns about the injury and death toll among Gaza. More than 40,000 people killed, 93,000 people injured, over half of them women and children, according to the Gaza Health. Much of this death and devastation is the result of the use of heavy weapons in densely populated areas, including in camps, shelters where civilians have been told to evacuate. Mr. President, members of the Council, the brutality of this conflict seems to know no limits. In the many attacks harming humanitarian workers, 295 humanitarian workers killed since October 7. We also see the attacks on humanitarian assets since January. United Nations vehicles have been directly hit in more than a dozen separate incidents, even though their movements were notified. Attacks hitting humanitarian personnel and their movement are further limiting the delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid. As noted last week, the World Food Programme draft movements following an attack that hit one of its convoys on 28 August. We see it in the reports of ill treatment, including sexual violence of thousands of Palestinians taken into detention by Israeli forces in Gaza and the West Bank. We see this in the party's reported use of human shields and presence in populated areas. The medical system in Gaza has been decimated, leaving people, including pregnant and breastfeeding women, children without critical care. 19 of Gaza's 36 hospitals, more than half, are out of service. As noted many times, the remaining hospitals are barely functioning, overwhelmed by patients amid shortages of fuel, medical supplies. Water infrastructure has been severely damaged, reducing the water supply to just a quarter of what it was before October 2023. Food sources and production facilities have been destroyed. Food delivery remains severely hampered by ongoing fighting, damaged roads, and barriers to the entry and movement of humanitarian supplies. Around 96% of the population continue to face high levels of acute food insecurity, with nearly 500,000 people facing catastrophic hunger. Humanitarian operations have been crippled, with growing denials of humanitarian missions and movements within Gaza, which is only causing suffering to compound further. This repeated evacuation orders leave civilians exposed to the dangers of hostilities and deprived of the essentials to survive. There is no safe place for Gaza. They must be allowed to seek protection. Mr. President, it does not have to be this way. Indeed, over the past few, there have been signs that humanitarian objectives can inspire positive steps. We welcome the local humanitarian pauses, which have enabled the launch of the emergency, as Secretary-General DiCarlo highlighted, and recognize the colossal efforts of human health actors to carry out the campaign in a very challenging environment. The Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator met with the highest government levels of the government of Israel yesterday on humanitarian concerns, including the importance of the polio campaign. According to World Health Organization, over 187,000 children under the age of 10 have been vaccinated in the first phase of the campaign, reaching more than 640,000 children in the coming period. UNRWA is playing a vital role, including with over 200 teams operating with and health points. We also welcome the repair of the main water line between Israel and Khan Yunis by local partners in cooperation with UNICEF. While the water and sanitation remains dire, the repair has restored water services in several areas, including Al-Mawasi, where hundreds of thousands of displaced people endure. Despite all the challenges, we remain on the ground in Al-Mawasi and across Gaza, providing essential assistance, including food and shelter, and protection services as best as we can. Food rations are being distributed, albeit at reduced levels, due to the lack of supplies excluded from the ration as it is prioritized for the 14 bakeries supported by humanitarian actors. Tents are also being distributed, though they are of course insufficient to match the displaced families, especially with the approaching cold and rainy weather. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, allow me to reiterate our concern from last. We remain very alarmed by the human toll of intensified Israeli military operations in the West Bank. On the night of 27 and 28 August, Israeli forces launched the largest in decades in northern West Bank against the backdrop of increased casualties, settler violence, forced displacement, and movement restrictions. And that operation is still ongoing. Humanitarian organizations assessed needs in Tulkarm and are responding, but were denied by Israeli forces for an assessment in Jenin. While access denials have limited our ability to fully assess the humanitarian impact, we can confirm that over 24 Palestinians have been killed over the past week. Hundreds of families have been displaced. There has been infrastructure and private property from airstrikes, military bulldozers, exchanges of fire and explosive detonations. I recall any use of force in the West Bank must comply with international human rights law and the standards governing law enforcement. Tactics typically used during hostilities are inconsistent with these standards and raise concerns of excessive use of force. Mr. President, respect for international humanitarian law and international is not optional. Allow me to restate that hostages must be released, civilians must be protected, and their essential needs must be met. And all member states must use their influence to ensure compliance, including by exerting diplomatic and other pressure and cooperating in pursuing accountability. We once again appeal to Council members and all member states to achieve an immediate cessation of hostilities and a sustained ceasefire in Gaza, and to de-escalate the situation in the West. Resolutions passed by this Council promised an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. They also called for the release of hostages, yet months later, the violence continues, more have been killed, and hostages remain separated from their families. It is time for this Council to turn its promises into reality and end the suffering. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Vosono for her briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Efrat Bron-Harlev.
Thank you for this opportunity. Shalom. My name is Efrat Bron-Harlev. I'm the CEO of Schneider Children's Medical Center of Israel and a intensive care physician. I'm also a mother of 4 boys. On October 7th, less than a year ago, our lives changed. By 7 o'clock in the morning, I was at hospital. under alarms, getting ready to move about 200 children hospitalized at Schneider's to sheltered areas. Children who come from throughout Israel and outside receive the best medical care we can give. Since the opening of our hospital 32 years ago, we have a mission, and that is to treat children, any children, are above and beyond everything, above and beyond religions, cultures, genders, and nationality. Children are above and beyond, and children are our. So on that morning, we were all in a hurry to get all of them and their parents to a safer area at the hospital and to be prepared to receive injured children. Hours, even a little more, I understood that we were not going to receive any children. I understood that few dozen of children that were wounded were treated in the but I also understood that many children of all ages, babies, toddlers, children, were butchered in their houses, shot, burned, choked, butchered. Then it took another day or two to understand that not only adults were kidnapped. Out of 153, 38 were children. The youngest, Kfir Bibas, still now in Gaza, was then only 8 months old. That we understood that there are children kidnapped, we took a decision to prepare for their return to Israel, return home. We are a very high-leveled, state-of-the-art pediatric hospital. All the needed knowledge of how to treat children in extreme situations, but we never imagined and never thought that we will have to prepare to treat 3, 5, 8, or 14 years old children that come back from captivity. We searched for literature, for some previous knowledge. We created new protocols that we knew would have to be very flexible and changeable when we see, hear, or examine the children once they. It took 50 days and more, 50 days in which young children were kept in captivity, kept in complete silence. They were not allowed to cry, allowed to laugh, not even allowed to stand up. They hardly ate, kept every bite of bread, moved from place to place in the middle of the night. When they arrived, they did not look like children. They looked like shadows of children. No impressions on their faces. They were not happy, crying. They were mostly very, very silent. Questions like, are we allowed to look out the window? May I step out of bed? Are we safe here? Asked. One girl, Gali, 14 years old, who was kept almost alone for most of the time in Gaza, was told by the terrorists that were holding her, no more Israel, that nobody is looking for her anymore, that nobody loves her. 14 years old. Sharon Cunio was kidnapped with her husband David, still now in Gaza. They were kidnapped with their 3-year-old twin girls, Emma and Yuli. One of them was taken away from them for 2 weeks on her own in Gaza. Only after 2 weeks, while she was burning with fever, she was reunited with her parents in captivity. When they returned, skinny, scared, silent, 2 days to get out of the rooms. Now, we are already 9 months after their return, definitely not back to their normal lives, still waking up terrified in the middle of the night, still talking about their terrible memories, and still waiting for their father, David. We received at Schneider 19 children, 6 mothers that were all in captivity. All of these children underwent unimaginable, horrific events when their closest relatives being murdered to captivity. Children are innocent bystanders of any war. Sadly, children are known to be unintentionally hurt as innocent bystanders. This should always be avoided. It should never happen. But unintentional is very then intentional. I simply cannot understand, cannot bear the thought that someone, a man, a woman, anyone, could murder and capture children, lock them, torture them, physically and mentally, on purpose, intentionally. I'm here today as an Israeli pediatric physician and head of one of the leading pediatric centers in the world to tell you no child should ever do what the children and civilians of Israel have gone through on October 7th. I need you to hear it, to understand it, and to help us bring that have not yet returned and bring back all that are held in captivity back to their families in Israel. I need you to all of us make sure that never again such intentional atrocities happen to children. Am Israel Chai, and thank you for this opportunity.
I thank Dr. Bron Harlev for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Yuli Novak.
Thank you. Members of the Security Council, it is an honor to address the Security Council today, and I thank the Slovenian presidency for the invitation to talk to you about the state of human rights in Israel-Palestine. On Sunday, we woke up to the news that 6 Israeli hostages were executed by Hamas as Israelis. Another 6, added to the tens of thousands of people in this land who should not have died over the past year. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets. They feel angry, desperate, and betrayed by their government. They have understood that the Israeli government does not want the hostages in a deal, but to continue the war indefinitely. To understand the Israeli government's criminal conduct over the last 11 months, the overall goal of this regime. Since Israel was founded, its guiding logic has been to promote Jewish supremacy over the entire territory under its control. The current government's guidelines state that, quote, the Jewish people have an exclusive and unquestionable right to all parts of the land of Israel. In the criminal Hamas-led attack on October 7th, 1,200 Israelis were killed and 250 taken hostages. Since that day, I and have been living in deep fear. Our government is cynically exploiting our collective trauma to violently advance its project of cementing the entire land. To do that, it is waging war on the entire Palestinian people, committing war crimes almost daily. In Gaza, the form of expulsion, starvation, killing, and destruction on an unprecedented scale. This goes beyond revenge. Israel is using the remote and ideological agenda, making Gaza inhabitable. As this council has been informed repeatedly, a vast part of Gaza's homes and infrastructure have been completely destroyed. By driving Palestinians out of entire areas and displacing millions, Israel is laying the groundwork for long-term control of Gaza, to re-establishing Israeli settlements there. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the government is exploiting the circumstances to create irreversible changes. In October, Israeli forces have killed 640 Palestinians there, including at least 140 minors. Settlers are attacking Palestinians and carrying out in broad daylight, with support of from the government. They have so far managed to drive 19 Palestinian community out of their homes. And recently, they launched a huge operation to damage infrastructures that serves hundreds of thousands of people in the northern West Bank. The international community did not stop Israel's criminal policy to civilians in Gaza. Now, this cruel policy is spilling over into the West Bank. The war on Palestinians is also happening inside prisons. Since October, Israel has arrested thousands of Palestinians and held them in inhumane conditions. Last month, we at B'Tselem published a report called Welcome to Hell. It shows the shame of abuse that amounts to torture. The government of Israel has used the war to turn Israeli prisons into a network of torture camps for Palestinians. Violence is possible because Israel has enjoyed impunity for decades. As long as this impunity continues, the killing and destruction will continue and expand, and to rule the land. The international community has failed its duty to protect civilians. 4 UN Security Council resolutions on the Gaza conflict did not lead to a lasting ceasefire or free the hostages. The risk of regional escalation has grown. Diplomatic efforts did not stop the mass killing of civilians and the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. We must acknowledge this failure and take effective action to compel Israel and Hamas to immediately and permanently cease all hostilities. But de-escalation, it is time for the Council to address the opinion of the International Court of Justice on the illegality of Israel's entire occupation and settlement project. If this Council does not act on the Court's call to end the occupation and apartheid, is another day you are abandoning us, the people of this land, who are suffering in tens of thousands needlessly under a cruel and unjust apartheid regime. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Novak for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make the statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, let me first congratulate you for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month, and I want to extend the full support of Algeria to your mandate. I wish also to congratulate Sierra Leone, very successful presidency during the month of August. At the outset, Mr. President, I express my profound gratitude to you for convening this meeting at a moment when our region, particularly the occupied Palestine, is witnessing serious violations that threaten to unravel the very foundations upon which the community has sought to resolve the conflict in the Middle East. I extend my thanks to both Mrs. Di Carlo and Mrs. Wosornu for their comprehensive briefings. And we listened carefully from the civil society. Their words vividly illustrate the magnitude of the suffering endured by Palestinian people. A suffering that underscores the failure of the international community, failure to enforce its own decision against an Israeli occupying power that acts with impunity from accountability. Mr. President, if we are gathered here today, It is because diplomacy. It is because this Security Council, entrusted with maintaining international peace and security, fulfilled its duty. How many lives could have been saved? How much suffering could have been avoided? Being more resolute in implementing our resolution, including Resolution 2735. I cannot help but think that had the ceasefire been imposed, more than 3,000 Palestinians, half of them women and children, would have been spared. I cannot help but think that had the ceasefire been enforced by this council, the 6 hostages would be allowed free today. For us, there can be no double standard in recognizing suffering or in grieving the loss of a loved one. For us, every life. Mr. President, the Israeli occupation continue inflicting collective punishment Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. The staggering toll of death and destruction reveals a barbarism aimed at Palestinian identity, and with it, the vision of the Palestinian state. As the world struggles to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, despite the clear demand from the international community, including the Israeli occupier, escalate since last week its operations in the West Bank to slaughter Palestinians in a blatant violation of international law. Since last October, in West Bank, 680 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli occupying forces and also by settlers, including 150 children. We all have condemned several times these wars and crime against humanity. But today, mere words are not enough. Today, we must act to ensure that the international law is above all. As the primary organ responsible for maintaining international and security, this Council must act without further delay to ensure its decisions are implemented and initiate a genuine and effective peace process in the Middle East. Mr. President, the sanctity of human life and the shared experience must unite us, lest we lose our humanity. For us, holds equal value, despite race, religion, or color, and we cannot turn a blind eye to any suffering. Every single innocent life matters. Yet, let us recognize that the plight of Palestinian detainees is often, too often, silenced or ignored. They endure abuse. They endure denial of access by the ICRC in a flagrant violation of humanitarian law and human rights law. Since October, the ICRC has reported more than 800 missing Palestinians, mainly from Gaza, with the occupying authorities refusing to provide any information or Red Cross visit. Today, over than 9,400 Palestinians, including 200 children, are held in Israeli prisons. Among them, more than 3,600 are administrative detainees. They are held for months without any charge. These detainees suffer abandoned by the international community. Since last October, the Israeli occupying authorities killed 24 Palestinian detainees while in their custody. Just this month, the day before yesterday, the Israeli forces brutally executed Ayman Abed through beating. Do you know what Ayman Abed's crime was? Nothing. He was arrested solely to pressure his son himself in. This is the policy of the occupation. Dear colleagues, the number 552 may be meaningless to many of you, but for Palestinian families, it represents their loved one still held by the Israelis occupier. Yes, the Israelis occupier is 552 bodies of Palestinians. Can we fathom that the body of Jasser killed in 1968 is still held by the Israeli occupier? Those responsible for all these crimes cannot remain unpunished. As President Tebboune stated, those involved in the massacre and extermination of Palestinians must be brought to justice. Mr. President, to conclude, we are faced with a test of our commitment to the principle that define the international orders. And it is the responsibility of the international community and this Security Council in particular to protect the multilateral system by reining in the occupation of that seek to extinguish the hope of Palestinian state. Silence and inaction in the face of these atrocities will only drive the region toward further escalation. I thank you.
The representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President, and allow me also to congratulate you on the presidency. And I would also like to commend Sierra Leone for a successful presidency during the month of August. Thanks to Carlo, Director Warsarnu, Dr. Bron Harlev, and Ms. Novak for your briefings during what is the first meeting in nearly a year on Hirsch Goldberg Paulin loved geography. For his bar mitzvah, he asked for atlases for the gift of understanding the world, of wrapping it in his arms. His father imagined that his son would someday work for National Geographic. Hirsch may have also become an American diplomat, a peace builder, someone who could forge even the deepest divides, and maybe even here in this room. I had the honor of getting to know Hirsch through his parents, Rachel and John. On October 7th, Hamas killed their son's friend, blew off their son's hand, and then stole their son's future, holding him hostage in the tunnels beneath Gaza for 331 days. Devastation, days bleed together, the sheer scale of loss anonymizes its victims. And yet Rachel and John insisted that the world know their son as a person. Every single day they relived the worst moments of their lives, talking to anyone and everyone who would listen to talk about Hirsch. Not only where he was, but who he was, why his fate and the fate of hundreds of hostages mattered, of thousands upon thousands of innocent Palestinians mattered too. That they too were people containing a universe who wanted and deserved peace, who wanted to and deserved to live. This past weekend, we learned the devastating and prayed would never come. That after nearly 11 months in captivity, Hirsch, along with 5 other hostages, was brutally killed by Hamas. And Kamel and Alex and Eden and Ori and Almog would never be reunited with their families. Moments like these tempt to retreat to their sides, to allow hurt to become hate. But I think about what Hirsch's father said just a few weeks ago, that there is, and I quote, surplus of agony on all sides of the tragic conflict in the Middle East. That in a competition of pain, there's. And so today I want to speak to the many, many people living in agony. That includes hostages that remain in the hands of Hamas, hailing from including the United States. We're doing all we can to bring these Americans home and all the hostages home to their families. Killed this weekend were executed at the same time negotiators were discussing the names of individuals to be released in a ceasefire deal. It questioned the sincerity of Hamas negotiators, and it reveals yet again the ugly truth about the vile, depraved ideology that Hamas represents. 1,200 people to its weaponization of sexual violence. These latest murders confirm that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I know some members won't acknowledge that, but that's the simple truth. No member of this council would tolerate their citizens being taken hostage and murdered. Not a single one of us. The United States strongly condemns Hamas's brutality. It is long, long past time this council do the same. Make no mistake, we condemn Hamas for what they are and still have empathy for the suffering Palestinians in Gaza, men, women, and children who are also experiencing. While Sinwar hides in tunnels underneath the ground and his henchmen murder hostages, Palestinians are living in a hell on earth. Their lives continue to be put at risk by his cowardice and intransigence. As President Biden has made clear, leadership will pay for their crimes. They must be held accountable. They cannot control Gaza. At the same time, we know that the best way to rescue the remaining hostages and alleviate the suffering of Palestinian civilians is through a negotiated ceasefire deal, one that will release the hostages, conditions to enable a surge in life-saving aid in Gaza. Colleagues, we cannot lose patience with diplomacy. The matter of snapping our fingers and voila. It takes hard work. It takes effort. And unfortunately, it takes time. After all, it was diplomacy that helped secure the release of more than 100 hostages in November. And it is through diplomacy that we bring the remaining hostages home and finally put this horrific conflict on a path toward a durable conclusion. The Israeli people should understand that there is one their leaders can accept, because this is a deal that ensures Israel's security. As President Biden emphasized when announcing of this deal, Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another attack on the scale of October 7th. And so we continue to work closely with Qatar and each find a way forward and do all we can to make this deal a reality once and for all. At this crucial inflection point, it is vital that anyone who stands with the three of us and continue to apply pressure on Hamas to end its brutality and accept the deal on the table, which is based on those and framework this council endorsed in Resolution 2735. We cannot just move on. There is no palatable alternative to this. Colleagues, we met last week on the issue of polio and protecting civilians. Since that meeting, Israel has coordinated closely with the UN to ensure the WHO began implementing a phased campaign vaccinating children under the age of 10 in Gaza. The United States welcomes the initial progress, thousands of vaccines administered in the first days of the campaign alone, and we reiterate the importance of UN and NGO personnel having the safety and space to administer polio vaccines and inoculate Gaza's at-risk population. Children's lives depend on their success. Separately, we're close in the West Bank. We're concerned about the recent uptick in Israeli military activity there and believe that actions could escalate tensions. Must be, in particular, violent rhetoric and attack by extremist settlers against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank are unacceptable and must stop. Israeli authorities must take measures to protect West Bank communities from harm, including by intervening to stop such violence and by holding all purple. And we continue to emphasize that a revitalized and reformed Palestinian Authority is in Israel's own interest, and that steps that bind the PA will not make Israel more secure. Indeed, Hamas's brutal murder of hostages is a reminder that a terrorist group does not and can to represent the vast majority of Palestinians. But Hamas's hateful ideology cannot be defeated through silence. Leaders in Ramallah and must condemn Hamas's violent actions and increase public pressure on Hamas to accept the deal on the table. Colleagues, I hoped and believed that I would see Hirsch Goldberg Pollen alive, that I could have met him, talked to him about the magic of exploring the world of healing. I believe that I could have hugged him and told him how hard his parents fought for him, how hard they fought for every hostage, every innocent Israeli and Palestinian whose life was destroyed by the scourge of war. I'm devastated that I will never be able to meet Hirsch. That his memory lives on in his extraordinary parents. I know that even though they have every reason to crawl under the cover and never emerge, they will continue to fight for humanity, to fight for dignity, for peace, for diplomacy, even when it feels impossible. For the return of the hostages, for an end to this horrific war, and for a better future for us all. But to them and their beloved son, to parents and children like them, Israeli and Palestinian alike, to do the same. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President,
Je remercie
I
Mesdames
wish
Di
to
Carlo
thank
et
Ms. Di
Woizornou
Carlo and
pour leurs
Ms.
interventions.
Woizornou for their
La
briefing.
France
France
a appris avec
was
indignation
outraged to
l'assassinat
learn
par le Hamas de
of
6
the
otages
hostages.
vont vers leurs familles et vers leurs proches,
Our
à qui
thoughts
nous
go out to
adressons
their
toutes nos
families and their loved
condoléances.
ones. We convey our
La France
condolences to
exprime sa
them.
pleine
France
solidarité
expresses that
envers
it
le peuple
stands in full
israélien.
solidarity with
Elle
the
redit sa
Israeli people.
condamnation des
Again,
actes
we
terroristes
state that
du
we
7
condemn in
octobre.
the strongest
Elle
terms the
réaffirme
terrorist
son
attacks of the
attachement
7th of October.
indéfectible à la
We
sécurité
reaffirm our
d'Israël.
unwavering commitment to
Nous
Israel's
appelons
security.
à la
We
libération
call
de tous les
for the
otages,
release of
y
all
compris celle de
hostages,
nos
in
compatriotes
the release
absolue
of
pour la
our French
France.
compatriots. That's an
Monsieur le
absolute priority
Président,
for France.
un
Mr. President,
cessez-le-feu
an
immédiat et
immediate and
permanent est
permanent ceasefire
indispensable
is
pour mettre
vital
fin
to put an
aux
end to
souffrances de
the
la
suffering of
population,
these civilians, to
l'acheminement massif
allow
de l'aide.
the
Cela ne peut plus
at-scale
attendre.
delivery
La
of aid
situation
that
humanitaire
can
est
no longer,
catastrophique,
that can wait no
tant au
longer.
plan
The
sanitaire
humanitarian
qu'au plan
situation is
alimentaire.
catastrophic, both
La
in
France
terms of
salue
healthcare and
le début de la campagne de
security.
vaccination
We
contre la
commend the
polio
beginning of the
grâce à
vaccination
l'OMS,
campaign
l'UNICEF
against
et
polio,
l'UNRWA.
thanks to UNICEF, the
L'accord
WHO,
sur
and
des pauses
UNRWA. The
humanitaires
agreement on
localisées
localized
qui a
humanitarian
permis cette
pauses,
campagne
which
doit
enabled that
prévaloir
campaign, must
aussi
prevail
longtemps
as long
sur
as
le
the
terrain
situation
le
on the
nécessitera.
ground so requires.
Cette campagne de
This
vaccination
vaccination
démontre
campaign
qu'il est
demonstrates
possible
that it is
de permettre
possible to
aux acteurs
allow
humanitaires d'agir
humanitarian
sur le
actors
terrain.
to act on
Ce
that must
règle,
become the
comme
rule
l'exige le
as
droit international
required under
humanitaire.
international
Monsieur
humanitarian
le
law.
Président,
Mr.
la
President,
France est
France
très
is
préoccupée
gravely
face à la
concerned
dégradation
by
rapide
the
de
rapid
la situation
worsening
au
of the
nord
north of
à la
the
suite des
West Bank
opérations militaires
following
israéliennes.
Israeli military
Celles-ci
operations.
contribuent à
These operations
l'instabilité
contribute to
et elles sont de
instability
nature
and
à
are
déclencher
liable
un
to
grave cycle de
trigger
violence
a
dans toute
grave
la
across the
La
whole of the
France
West
condamne la
Bank.
politique
France
de
condemns
colonisation.
the settlement policy.
Celle-ci est
That
contraire au droit
policy runs
international.
counter to
Les
international
autorités
law.
israéliennes doivent
Israeli
faire
authorities
cesser les
must put a
violences
stop
et la
to this
politique de
violence
terreur
as the policy of
extrémiste.
terror used by
Monsieur le
certain
Président, la
extreme
solution
settlers. Mr.
pour
President,
mettre
the
fin
only solution
à
to
la
put an
guerre
end to
ainsi
the
qu'au
war
désastre
and
humanitaire
to the
qui
humanitarian
dure depuis
catastrophe
11
which
mois dans
have
la bande
played
de
out
Gaza
strip
entre le
is
Hamas
an
et
agreement
Israël.
between
Hamas et Israël.
Hamas
La
and
France
Israel.
soutient
France
les efforts de médiation
supports
des
the
États-Unis,
mediation efforts
de
of the
l'Égypte et
United
du
States,
Qatar.
Egypt, and Qatar.
Ces négociations
These
doivent
negotiations
enfin
must
aboutir. France appelle
conclude.
les parties à
France
faire les
calls
compromis
upon
nécessaires.
parties to make the
Face à la
necessary
montée des tensions au
compromises.
Moyen-Orient,
In the
ce
face of
Conseil
rising
doit tout
tensions in the
faire
Middle East,
pour
this council
éviter
must
un
do everything in
embrasement
its power to
régional.
avoid a region.
En
France
ce
is
sens, en
continuing
lien
such
avec ses
efforts
partenaires.
together
Je
with
vous
its
remercie.
partners. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and Secretary-General De Carlo, Director Wasonu, Dr. Bronhalev, and Ms. Novak for briefing us today. Last week, we news that the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages were recovered in Gaza. We condemn their murder by Hamas. My Prime Minister has conveyed prayers for the families and the Israeli people. Israel's request for this briefing to shine a spotlight on of Hamas and their impact on innocent civilians. It is also entirely right, as Algeria proposed, to focus on recent grave development in the West Bank and Gaza. President, of the 253 hostages taken in the horrific 7th of October terror, 101 hostages remain captive in Gaza and subject to unimaginable horror. We once again condemn in the strongest terms. We reiterate our demand for Hamas to release the hostages immediately. There can be no doubt pays not the slightest heed to international humanitarian law. We urge all parties to agree a ceasefire deal which would bring an end of these hostages. Israel continues to face threats, not only from Hamas, but also from Iran, hostile proxies who openly call for Israel's annihilation. Iran should be in no doubt of our commitment to challenge them and destabilizing activity and our commitment to Israel's security. President, the suffering of also worsens each day. Over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, many of whom are women and children. The basic needs of children and thousands of orphaned children are unmet. A ceasefire deal offers an opportunity to end their suffering. As we've heard, the situation in Gaza is beyond appalling, with dire sanitary conditions, a serious risk of famine, now polio. We welcome the polio vaccination campaign and urge Israel to continue to cooperate with the WHO and health agencies so that the full 90% of children who need to be are vaccinated. More generally, as we've heard, humanitarian access remains inadequate. Convoys, evacuation orders undermining operations, and aid far below Israel's stated commitment to flood Gaza with aid. Israel to do much more to ensure life-saving food and medical supplies reach civilians in Gaza. As my Foreign Secretary said this week, so deeply concerned by credible claims of mistreatment of Palestinian detainees, which the International Committee of the Red Cross cannot investigate after being dismissed by Israel. President, concerns on the treatment of detainees and humanitarian access were part of my government into Israel's international humanitarian law compliance. As a result, my Foreign Secretary took the decision to suspend certain arms export licenses to Israel earlier this week. This decision in no way undermines our unwavering commitment to Israel's security. Whilst we recognize Israel's need to defend itself against security threats, the UK is also deeply worried by the ongoing ID West Bank, particularly the reports of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Israel must also tackle accelerating settler violence and end its illegal expansion of settlements, which undermine prospects for the realization of the two-state solution. Let me conclude by thanking the US, Qatar, and Egypt for their efforts in the ongoing negotiations. The parties study the deal on the table. The parties must now bridge their differences and end the suffering by agreeing to a deal and rediscover the path to a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Président, et comme il s'agit de notre première déclaration au Conseil ce mois, permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier la Sierra Leone pour sa présidence le mois passé et de vous souhaiter de votre présidence en ce mois de septembre. J'aimerais, comme mes collègues, également remercier les 4 briefeurs de ce jour, la secrétaire générale aux affaires politiques, la directrice des opérations du plaidoyer à OCHA, Mme Edem Bozornou, Mme Efrat Braun-Harlef, directrice du Centre médical Schneider, et Mme Yuli Novak, directrice exécutive de leur présentation. La Suisse a fermement condamné les actes de terreur, la prise et la détention d'otages perpétrés par le Hamas et d'autres groupes depuis le 7 octobre dernier. Nous sommes profondément choqués par les informations confirmées par l'ONU, selon lesquelles 6 otages ont été exécutés par le Hamas à Gaza le 1er septembre. La capture d'otages et leur exécution sont des violations du droit international humanitaire. Ces violations constituent des crimes de guerre et leurs auteurs doivent être traduits en justice. Nous condamnons ces actes avec la plus grande fermeté et présentons nos condoléances à leurs proches. La Suisse appelle à la libération inconditionnelle de tous les otages. Ces derniers et leurs familles vivent depuis 11 mois un véritable calvaire. Les otages doivent être traités avec humanité, avec les normes du droit international et bénéficier sans plus tarder des visites du CICR et de l'aide médicale dont ils ont besoin. Cela vaut aussi pour toutes les personnes détenues par Israël avec le conflit, en particulier les mineurs. Monsieur le Président, la situation humanitaire à Gaza demeure catastrophique. Nous venons de l'entendre encore. Nous rappelons que les civils sont protégés. Aussi, nous condamnons toutes les attaques à l'encontre des civils qui représentent des violations flagrantes du droit international humanitaire et des crimes de guerre. Le personnel humanitaire doit être protégé afin de venir en aide aux civils dans le besoin, comme demandé par la résolution 2730. Pour cela, les armes doivent se taire. Ceci permettre aux agences de l'ONU et à ses partenaires de mener à bien les 2 phases de vaccination nécessaires et protéger 640 000 enfants contre la polio à Gaza. Je salue le fait que, selon l'OMS, et nous venons de l'entendre aussi, la première phase se déroule sans incident majeur dans le centre de la bande de Gaza. Nous saluons le personnel humanitaire pour son engagement et son courage dans des conditions très difficiles et exhortons toutes les parties à continuer à faciliter cette campagne. Comme il a été dit durant la séance demandée par la Suisse la semaine passée, cette campagne démontre qu'une opération humanitaire d'envergure est possible à Gaza si les hostilités cessent et qu'un accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave, conformément au droit international humanitaire. Il est grand temps que cela devienne une réalité, et ce, dans toute la bande de Gaza. Monsieur le Président, un cessez-le-feu dans toute la bande de Gaza. La Suisse réitère son soutien à la médiation des États-Unis, du Qatar et de l'Égypte pour trouver un accord en ce sens
conformément
find
à
an
la
agreement
résolution 20 de ce
in
Conseil.
accordance with
Un
Security
tel
Council Resolution
cessez-le-feu apportera aussi une
2735.
contribution majeure
Such a
à la
ceasefire will also
désescalade
make a
régionale,
major contribution
mais cela
to
n'est pas
regional
suffisant.
de-escalation.
Pour
But
éviter
this
à
is
tout
not
prix
enough.
la régionalisation,
Until
le respect du droit
conflagration
international,
and
y
spill over the
compris du droit
conflict,
international
international
humanitaire
law,
et des droits
including
humains,
international
est
humanitarian
nécessaire.
law and human rights, must
Cela
be
s'applique aussi à la
respected at
Cisjordanie, y
all
compris
costs. This also applies
Jérusalem-Est,
to the West
où
Bank,
la
including
violence
violence
depuis la
has
seconde
never been this
intifada,
high
en
since the
particulier
second
en raison
intifada,
des attaques de colons et
specifically as a
des opérations
consequence of
menées
attacks
par
by
les forces de
settlers as well as
sécurité
operations that
israéliennes,
are being carried
comme
out by
celles
Israeli
actuellement dans
security
les
forces. This
gouvernorats
is currently taking
Tulkarem et
place in
Toubas.
the Jenin,
Dans ces
Tulkarem,
opérations,
and Tubas
l'usage de la
governorates.
force par
In
Israël
these
doit notamment
operations, the use of
répondre
force
aux
by
critères
Israel
de la
must,
nécessité
in particular,
et de
meet
la
the criteria of
proportionnalité et tout
necessitationality
individu à la
and
vie et à la
respect every
sécurité de sa
individual's right
personne.
to life
À
and
défaut, et
security
comme le
of the
rappelle aussi la
person.
Cour internationale de
As has been
justice dans
pointed
son
out
avis
in the International
consultatif
Court of
du
Justice in
19
its
juillet,
advisory opinion dating
excessif de la
19
force
July,
et le fait
excessive
qu'Israël
use of
manque de
force
prévenir ou de
and
punir les
Israel's
attaques de
failure
colons
to prevent
sont
or punish settler
incompatibles avec
attacks
les
are
obligations d'Israël en
incompatible with
vertu du droit
Israel's
international.
obligations under
La
international.
Israël, en tant que
Switzerland
puissance
stresses that
occupante, est
Israel, as the
responsable
occupying
du maintien
power,
de l'ordre
is
en
responsible
Cisjordanie
for the
et
maintenance of law and
d'assurer
order
la
in the West
protection
Bank
et le bien-être de la
and for
population,
ensuring the
qui
protection
comprend la
and
réalisation
well-being of the
de leurs droits
population,
fondamentaux. Nous
of their
exhortons les
fundamental
autorités
rights.
israéliennes
We
à traduire en
urge the
justice
Israeli
tous les auteurs
authorities
de violences
to
envers les
bring to
civils
justice
et de
all
destruction
perpetrators of violence
délibérée
against
de biens et
civilians and the
infrastructures
deliberate
civiles.
destruction of civilian
Appellerons
infrastructure.
inlassablement
We will
tout
state
acte
this
de
again and
violence à
again.
l'encontre de
Any
civils,
act of violence against
israéliens et
civilians,
palestiniens,
Israelis
est
or
inacceptable.
Palestinians, is
Le droit international doit
unacceptable.
être respecté
International
en étape
perspective
essentielle
as an
sur le
essential
chemin de
first
la paix.
step on the path
Ce chemin doit
towards
aboutir
peace.
à la
This
solution
path
négociable des
must
États,
lead to a
Israël et la
negotiated
Palestine,
two-state
dont
solution
Gaza fait
with
partie
Israel and
intégrante,
Palestine, of
et
which
vivant
Gaza is
côte à
inside
côté
in peace
à
and
l'intérieur de
security
frontières sûres et
within
reconnues.
secure and
Je vous
recognized
remercie.
borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, presidente, y
Thank you,
agradezco
President.
a
I
los oradores
wish
por
to thank
sus
the briefers
exposiciones
for
informativas,
their
a la
informative
presidencia
briefings,
por convocarnos de
and
manera
I thank
rápida
the
y eficiente,
presidency for convening this
respondiendo
meeting,
a pedidos
quick
de
in response
delegaciones.
to
Le
requests from
felicito
several
además
delegations.
por asumir
Moreover,
la
I
presidencia
congratulate
y
you on
ofrezco
assuming the
todo el
presidency this
apoyo
month, and I
de esta
offer
delegación.
you, this delegation,
El
full
Ecuador
support.
condena enérgicamente
Ecuador
el
roundly
asesinato de los 6
condemns
rehenes
the
y los
hostages
cadáveres fueron
whose
encontrados en el
corpses
sur
were
de la
found in
franja
the
el
south of
pasado
the
fin de
Gaza
semana.
Strip last
El
weekend.
asesinato de
The
rehenes
killing of
es una
hostages
grave
is a grave
violación de los derechos
violation of
humanos
human
y del
rights
derecho
and of
internacional.
those
Responsables
responsible
deben ser
must
llevados
be
ante la
brought to
justicia
justice
y pagar
and must
por sus
pay
actos.
for their
Mi país
actions.
extiende
My
sus
country
condolencias
conveys
a
its
las
condolences
familias
to
de los
the
rehenes muertos.
families of the dead
Es
hostages. It is
la
imperative
liberación
that we
de
see
los
the release
101
of the
rehenes
101
que permanecen
hostages
en poder
which
de Hamas
are
desde su
still
secuestro,
in
producido
Hamas's
durante
hands,
los ataques
where they have been
terroristas
since their capture,
perpetrados
with
el
attacks
pasado 7
perpetrated
de
by that
octubre,
group on the 7th of
ataques
October,
que mi
attacks which
país
my country
deplora
yet
una vez
again
más.
decries.
Esta liberación de
Moreover,
rehenes
this
debe
release
producirse
of
de
hostages
manera
occur
e
immediately
incondicional.
and
Es
unconditionally.
asimismo necesario
Moreover,
un
we
inmediato
need
alto
to
al fuego
see an
que
immediate
permita mejorar
ceasefire,
las
one which makes
condiciones
it possible to
humanitarias
improve
cada vez más
the
difíciles
increasingly
en
difficult
Gaza
facing the
y
civilian
reducir
population
las
in
tensiones
Gaza,
regionales.
and
El Ecuador
one which
condena
reduces
también los
regional
ataques
tensions.
contra
Ecuador
civiles
also
y
condemns
personal
attacks against
humanitario.
civilians and
Es
humanitarian
preciso
personnel.
detener
Death
y
and
destrucción.
destruction
En
must
definitiva,
stop.
lo sucedido hace
Ultimately, what has
evidente
happened
la
makes it
necesidad
painfully clear
de la
that we need to
implementación de la
see the
resolución
implementation of
2735
Resolution
de este Consejo,
2735
excusas
without
ni demoras
excuses or
artificiales. Para
artificial
el efecto,
delays.
las
To
partes
this
deben
effect,
concluir ya sus
parties must
negociaciones
immediately
de
conclude
buena fe,
negotiations in good faith,
mostrando voluntad
demonstrating
política,
and
verdadera
genuine
valentía.
courage.
Este sería el menor
That
homenaje
would be
al
the
interés superior de los
very
niños
slightest
palestinos
tribute that we could pay, the smallest step that we could take to protect Israeli and Palestinian children that should be protected at all times. They shouldn't be wounded, and far less should they be deliberately attacked. The Asian campaign against polio, which began a few days ago, is a demonstration of the fact that with genuine political will, results can be achieved. Ecuador commends and is grateful for the work of WHO agencies that are involved in this effort. Turning now to the situation in the West Bank, the escalation of violence and the large-scale military operations conducted in the area in recent compel us to reiterate appeals made on several occasions for all to act with moderation and restraint, ensuring that the provisions of humanitarian law are complied with at all times. We must always recall that civilians and civilian infrastructure cannot be the target of attacks. They enjoy protection. Finally, it is necessary to halt provocations and statements which exacerbate violence. The status quo of Jerusalem's holy sites must be, the time has come to act responsibly. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, allow me to firstly congratulate you on the assumption of the presidency of the Council. You have Guyana's full support, and I also to the delegation of Sierra Leone for their excellent stewardship last month. I thank Under Secretary-General Di Carlo and Director Wasorno for the information. I also listened carefully to the moving words of Dr. Efrat Brun-Harlev and Ms. Yuli Novak. Mr. President, the arbitrary deprivation of individuals' liberty is one of the most egregious crimes. It is particularly repulsive because it attacks a person's dignity, especially when that individual, mother, father, sister, brother, grandparent, or relative, is reduced to a bargaining chip. Guyana reiterates its strong condemnation of the taking of the 7th October attacks on Israel and underscores that such actions constitute a grave violation of international law, particularly Common Article of the Geneva Conventions. On the same principle, Mr. President, we also demand the immediate release of all Palestinians arbitrarily detained in Israel. No life is more valuable than the other, and a crime is still a crime, regardless of the perpetrator. Mr. President, the people of Palestine continue to and are now being dragged to the edge of the precipice. From all indications, they will be thrown over that precipice, except drastic measures by the Council and by those countries with real influence to stop the aggressor. This is simply what is needed for the aggression of the occupying power against the Palestinians to stop immediately and unconditionally. We should, however, not entertain the dangerous notion that the cessation of hostilities in the Gaza, to which those hostilities are now spreading, is a privilege we must implore the occupying power to grant to innocent civilians in Palestine. Neither should we equally dangerous notion that Israel has the right to defend itself in whatever manner it deems fit. On the contrary, Israel has both legal and moral to end its hostilities in Gaza and the West Bank, and to take all actions to ensure the protection of civilians and the provision of essential goods and services for their survival. How many more briefings do we need to hear? And how many more tragic figures must we be apprised of before we take meaningful and decisive measures to stop the genocide of Palestinians? 86 days ago, this Council adopted Resolution 2735 with the fervent conviction that we were setting the stage for resolving a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and a surge in humanitarian assistance. Sadly, in the 86 days since Resolution 2735 was adopted, toll in Gaza rose by over 3,600 and those injured by more than 9,500. These developments developments in Gaza are compounded, increasing violence and killing of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. Things have only gotten worse for Palestinians, for the Israeli hostages, and indeed the entire region, the adoption of that resolution. The goalpost seems to be shifted at every turn, with Hamas and Israel accusing each other of obstructing progress. With a deal being seemingly elusive, Guyana urges this council to act swiftly to bring an end to the atrocities being meted out against Palestinians. Mr. President, dear colleagues, as the UN prepares for the summit of the future, I am compelled to contemplate what the future means for Palestinians. A possible horizon of hope. In a struggle older than these chambers, the future looks bleak. The occupying power sits at the head of the table of those and of a culture of hatred between Israelis and Palestinians. While people on both sides suffer, politicians stoke discourse self-preservation. Let us call a spade, Mr. President. Who are the real benefactors of this ongoing war in Gaza? It is not right, nor legal, to continue fueling this war, where those bearing the brunt are innocent women and children. Guyana believes that the majority of our leaders cannot comfortably adopt the pact for the future with its noble aspirations while turning a blind eye to the ongoing indiscriminate killings of us. History is already judging us, but this council has the power and responsibility to turn this tide. Mr. President, it is worth Palestine today did not begin on 7/23. We must cast our minds back to 1948, because it was in that year that we rejected the two-state solution. Since then, that violent rejection has continued, manifested in cycles and ever-expanding activities inter alia. What we have seen since 7th of October are the symptoms of this rejection of the two-state solution, with the victimizer capitalizing horrific events of September, October, to carry out its own sinister motives, even amidst protests by its own citizen. Again, Mr. President, let us call a spade a spade. Over these last few days, the names of the hostages whose bodies were recovered have been repeated, and we have come to know a bit about their lives. It is the least that we could do to honor their memory and the tragic circumstances under which they died. This compelled me to also contemplate the thousands who were killed since 7th of October, whose names could not all be mentioned, lest we took a day for every 10,000 persons killed. Guyana believes that the best way to honor the memory of both Palestinians and Israelis who have died in this war is for this council to take immediate action to end this war. We are at our disposal. Let us use them. In conclusion, Mr. President, while each briefing is a grotesque recollection of all the horrors, it must be more than that. It must be a call to action. It must be a call to action to which the Council responds decisively, substantively, effectively. While Plato asserted that only the dead have seen the end of war, this Council can ensure that remaining generations of Palestinians and Israelis also see and experience the end of war, and more than that, experience sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to express our gratitude to CIE for their successful presidency in August, and wish Slovenia, the president for this month, the best of luck. Let me also thank USG DiCarlo Director Dr. Bron-Harev and Ms. Novak for their respective briefings. We are almost 11 months into, and yet violence and tragedies in Gaza are never ending. The news that 6 hostages held by Hamas were found dead is truly heartbreaking. Is deeply saddened and outraged by the murder of these innocent hostages, and we express our sincere condolences to their bereaved families and loved ones. It is inhumane and totally unacceptable to use hostages' lives as bargaining chips. Hamas must release all remaining hostages. Turning to the overall situation in Gaza, Japan remains appalled by the ever-increasing civilian casualties, mostly women and children. The massive displacement and the worst situation due to the relentless hostilities. We welcome the successful implementation of the first few days of the polio vaccination campaign under the temporary pauses. We are relieved to hear that more than 180,000 children have been vaccinated so far. The brave efforts and dedication of the relevant UN agencies, despite the However, the suffering of Palestinians and the desperate situation in Gaza will remain the same as long as the fighting continues. Nowhere is safe. People are compressed into ever smaller areas by the repeated evacuation orders. There are critical shortages of food, medicine, clean water, necessities. Public order has collapsed, further threatening the well-being of the population and creating challenges to the work of aid workers. In short, the highest price of the conflict. Japan reiterates that all parties must strictly abide by the relevant principles of international humanitarian law. Most importantly, the protection of civilians, and must secure the safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. Mr. President, while Japan is also seriously concerned about the deteriorating situation in the West Bank. We deeply regret the continuing settlement activities and condemn extreme settler against Palestinians. Most recently, the ongoing large-scale Israeli military operations in the West Bank and their ramifications are alarming. Mr. President, in the inflamed Middle East, one thing that can relieve tensions in the region is a deal that brings the hostages home, achieves an immediate ceasefire, and expands humanitarian aid at scale throughout Gaza. In this regard, Japan strongly supports the tireless diplomatic efforts by the US, Egypt, and Qatar, and urges both parties to swiftly conclude the deal in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2735. All parties must prioritize to end the agony of innocent civilians resting on political gains. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this meeting at the request of the State of Israel, supported by the delegations of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and separately requested by the delegation to discuss various issues related to the conflict in Gaza. I thank the briefers, Under Secretary-General Rosemary DiCarlo and Director Idem Wasuno for the important briefings. And I thank Dr. Ifred Bron-Harev and Ms. Yul Novak for the information provided. Sierra Leone congratulates Slovenia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. You, Mr. President, and your team, the very best. I assure you of our fullest support. Let me also thank all council members for their support during our presidency in August. One of the consequences of the heinous attack of 7th October 2023 on Israeli civilians was the taking of about 250 hostages by Hamas and other armed groups, an act that contravenes international law, including the 4th Geneva Convention, which explicitly prohibits hostage taking as a grave breach of international humanitarian law. Is reaffirmed under the International Committee of the Red Cross Rule 96 of the customary international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone, since the 7th of October 2023, condemned and has repeatedly condemned in the strongest terms and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas. Therefore, it is deeply concerning to note the content of the letter dated 1st September 2024, addressed to the Secretary-General of the United Nations and the President of the Security Council, from the permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations, informing of the discovered bodies of 6 Israeli hostages held in the tunnels of Hamas since 7th October 2023, with 101 hostages still unaccounted for by Hamas. This tragic loss, combined with the prolonged suffering of the remaining hostages in worsening, unpredictable, and unknown conditions without any humanitarian access, underscore the need for impartial, independent investigations and accountability for those responsible. In this regard, Sierra Leone continues to support the work of the prosecutor of the court since he announced the opening of investigations into the situation in the state of Palestine, following